Hi everyone. Here we are. I hope everyone's doing well with distance learning and just dealing with this quarantine. I know it's a weird time. I miss all you guys. I miss laughing it up with you guys. I hope that everyone is keeping their eyes on the prize and staying diligent to complete their work. All right. Although the regencies have been canceled and it appears that you won't have to take them, you guys will move on to chemistry next year without having to take the regents. It is important that you understand and you learn the things that we still have to learn ultimately for the regents. But really, you should know this stuff because after chemistry, they're going to take other science courses, and if you want to be a science major in college, you want to become a doctor or a nurse or even a science teacher or anything involving science, you're going to have to know some of the basics of biology. Even if you're going to go on to be a chemist, you should know the biological sciences and you should understand a lot of these concepts. So, as much as you might feel like this is pointless, all right, learning is part of life and you should always be learning. Anyone that wants to make money and anyone that wants to help people, in order to do those two things, which a lot of people consider success, all right, success, some people consider it money, some people consider it the ability to help other people. Either way, you're gonna need to know things. You're gonna have to be able to learn, and you should continue to learn even as we move forward. So even though you might feel like, oh, you know what, I'm good till September, you really should be learning whether there's a Regents exam or a big test at the end or not. Learning is important in trying to be successful, no matter really what you define success as. So I hope you guys are doing the best you can to continue learning. And I know, it is a weird time, but just because there's no regions doesn't mean that learning doesn't matter. And that's in life. I continue to learn new things not because there's a test at the end or I need to do it so that I can stay a teacher or anything like that. I do it because it's important to make myself better and for me to uh, be more successful in, well, not only making money, but be successful in helping other people. So when I'm going on and learning new things, I'm learning new things in order to maybe know more for my children, maybe know more so I can teach my students, help my family out, whatever it may be. You need to be able to benefit from learning. You need to take advantage of learning. So don't check out just yet. We still have some time to learn, and we have a lot of things left to learn. So we finish up with genetics, and genetics really goes on to look at the bigger picture. So as much as we talked about genetics and we looked at what's in the cell and the DNA and what the DNA codes for, well, it codes for different proteins, and really the proteins really make up the different traits, and the traits are really what are going to be either beneficial or not beneficial in the environment. And when we look at traits and whether they're beneficial or not beneficial, we are really looking at evolution. So that's where you see that, all right, we move away from genetics, but genetics and evolution really go hand in hand. So, what do you know about evolution? Now, a lot of people know, they've heard it before, they have a general idea what it's about. Maybe, I think it's about maybe changing. All right, do you think it's a positive or a negative thing? So think to yourself, what do I know about evolution? And a lot of people think, what, when I went to church, I heard it was a bad thing, or someone I know said that they don't like the theory, they don't like the idea. So, as much as you hear about good things and bad things, it's important to understand the theory. And I'm not saying that, hey, you have to believe it 100%, but what I'm saying is that in biology, if you want to become a biologist or anything in the biological sciences, you have to at least understand the theory and the ideas behind it so that you can keep up with anyone that's talking about it. So, you know, to me, I believe in evolution. I also believe in religion. So it doesn't necessarily have to be this separate thing where you either believe one or you believe the other. I think you can find a common ground, but I always tell students I'm not here to say, you have to believe this or you have to believe this, but what I am here to tell you is that, hey, if you're going to take a biology test, say an evolution test, well, you can't just say, you know what, I don't believe this stuff. I'm not answering any of these questions. I should get 100 anyway. No, you should be able to answer the questions and understand the theory and the ideas behind it. So, as much as I'm not going to say you have to believe any of this stuff, you do have to understand the ideas and the concepts. So, what exactly is evolution? Well, just plain and simple, evolution is the change in a species over a long period of time. So I always tell students, because a lot of times students say, my grandmother wasn't a chimpanzee. I didn't come from chimpanzees or anything. No one's saying that. But what we're saying is that over a long period of time, over millions and millions of years, little changes amount to big changes. And that's where we see over millions and millions of years the big changes of being able to go from a fish to a human. So when we say a species has evolved, we mean that the population. So we never say that just one person has evolved. If one person changes, we just say, hey, that person has a mutation. But when we start to see that entire population, everyone start to have that mutation, or most of the people start to have that mutation, that's when we say that we're seeing evolution in that population. So now evolution is driven by natural selection. So when you think of evolution, you should think of natural selection. And we talked about artificial selection in class, and we talked about how if we are going to pick certain traits, right? If you have a pit bull and you want to make the biggest pit bull possible, well, you're going to take the biggest mama pit bull and the biggest papa pit bull, and you're going to breed them, and then from that later you're going to take the biggest mama and the biggest papa, and you're going to breed them, and you're going to keep going until eventually you get bigger and bigger, or you get the biggest pit bull you can get. Well, that is um, artificial selection or selective breeding. But we're talking about natural selection, and the main word in that is nature. All right, natural selection. That's where nature is doing the deciding. It's the environment. Okay, the environment is deciding which traits are going to stay and which traits are not fit for that environment. And when we talk about fit, okay, we always talk about this idea of fit. Well, what is fit? What is fitness? Okay, fitness. Oops, sorry. Fitness, or being the fittest, has to do with um, being able to survive in that environment. So a lot of times students say, being the biggest or the strongest or having the biggest teeth or being the best at camouflaging makes you fit. Well, that's not necessarily true. It really depends on the environment. And maybe it is being the biggest. Maybe it's being the smallest. Maybe it's having the most camouflage. Maybe camouflage doesn't really matter. But when we look at natural selection, it's all about who's going to survive and who's going to go extinct because of nature, because of the environment. So natural selection, right? Mother Nature is choosing. I'm not choosing. You're not choosing. Nothing else choosing. It's the environment. It's Mother Nature. Nature, the environment, is choosing from a number of variations or from mutations that occur within a species, which is best suited or which is fit. Okay, best suited or which is most fit for that specific environment. So, just because you're fit or you're suited for one environment doesn't mean you're suited for another environment. You think about, how well would we do as a species if we had gills instead of lungs? Well, guess what? We wouldn't do very well at all because we live on land. If we had gills, we wouldn't be able to breathe. All right. Same thing goes for fish. How well would they do if they had lungs? Not very well. They live in water. They need gills in order to breathe. So natural selection has separated humans from other primates. Meanwhile, our DNA sequences remain very similar. If you look at the differences, we share about 98.2% of our DNA with chimpanzees. So our DNA is very, very similar, but you see in this 1.8% difference, that's what makes us different from chimpanzees. So little changes in the DNA can really make big changes from one individual or one organism to the next. So where did this whole idea come from? Well, in reality, um, different people had thought of different theories along the way and they had different ideas, but the person that we credit with the idea, Charles Darwin, all right, he really came up with this idea, and we've seen that what he said, and he said this stuff over 150 years ago, what he said is still relevant. The things that he thought about and the ideas he had still relevant. We know a lot more than he did, all right, because now we are, we're able to look at DNA, which he wasn't able to do, and we're able to study more things than he was. We know a lot more about cells and molecular genetics and all these other things he wasn't able. But the basic concept that he came up with is still true, that he said over 150 years ago. So Charles Darwin, what he actually did is he went to the Galapagos Islands, and at the time, the Galapagos Islands, they didn't have any people inhabiting that land. Okay, so no one lived there. There was just these organisms there. There were, just animals there, and the animals that lived there, they didn't really know to be afraid of humans or anything like that. So he was able to go there and really collect data on the different organisms, and they let him get close to them, and he realized that, a big thing is that there were these different birds. And when he looked at the different birds on the different islands, because these Galapagos Islands, it's numerous different islands all clustered together, which is called an archipelago, and archipelago. He noticed that these different birds, they all seemed kind of similar, but they had different beaks, and he thought they were different type of birds. But what he came to find out is that they were all actually finches, which there are different species of finches, but he found that they're all the same really type of bird, not the same species, but the same type. So he said, you know what? Maybe it's that all these birds were once the same. They were all the same exact species of finch, but over time, by being in different environments, because each island had a different type of environment, different type of food there, over time, these finches became different species. So he created and published his theory of evolution by natural selection after a number of years of him kind of sitting on it and thinking about it. And it stated that survival of the fittest was responsible for natural selection and evolution. And survival of the fittest is individuals most fit. Here we go again. Fit. What does fit mean? Well, it doesn't mean the biggest, the strongest, the smartest, the best camouflage, anything like that. It's just which ones are most adapted or gonna be best suited for the specific environment that they are in. So a variation between the individuals will either help or it'll hinder or hurt their ability to survive and reproduce. So here we look at a question that someone could ask you about evolution. So you say inherited instructions control the color patterns of snakes. All right, so inherited instructions. Hopefully, you have some kind of idea what they're talking about here. And some snakes that are not poisonous have colors that resemble the patterns of poisonous snakes. So we got two different snakes. They look very similar, but one happens to be poisonous, one is not poisonous. Predators avoid eating harmless snakes, right, that have color patterns similar to those that are harmful or poisonous snakes. And the results of a recent study indicate that the predators in areas that have only harmless snakes do not avoid attacking snakes that have color patterns similar to the poisonous snakes. So if you go to an area where there are no poisonous snakes, well, the predators are going to eat those harmless snakes because they don't know that any type of snake is going to be poisonous. So it says, identify the structure that contains the inherited instructions that determine the different color patterns in the snakes. And we should all be shouting, oh, that's got to be DNA. Now it says state one advantage for a non-poisonous snake having coloration similar to that of a poisonous snake. Well, predators will avoid eating them. Okay, state one reason why predators in some areas attack and eat harmless snakes, even though they have color patterns similar to poisonous snakes. All right, they are not aware that snakes can be poisonous. Right? So if you go to an area where all the snakes are non-poisonous, well, they don't know that somewhere else there's similar snakes that are poisonous. So they're going to continue to eat the snakes even though they look like ones that are poisonous somewhere else. So we have these classic examples of evolution that we talk about. And it's important to know these classic examples of evolution, because they come up on the regions and they come up all the time in any biology class or even some science classes that you're going to take. So the peppered moth is one, and there are very few, close to none, of the white moths left is one example. All right, with the peppered moths, we see that there, during the Industrial Revolution, there were white moths and black moths of the same species. They just had different variations, just like people have different hair color, stuff like that. So pepper moths, there were different colors, but they saw that once the Industrial Revolution hit, and all the factories were blowing all this soot and smoke into the air, and the area was covered in the soot and it was all black. Well, now they saw that the white ones didn't survive very well, so and the black ones really did survive well because they blended in with the soot. So this is a classic example of how evolution occurs. And what happens is that over time, there were less white moths because they were easy to be seen by the predators, and there were more black moths over time. Another example is when we talk about insecticides. When you spray insecticides, it kills most of the insects. But if there is some insect that has some genetic mutation that makes it be able to survive in that insecticide or that bug spray, and it has, we say that it has that resistance to it. Well, over time, you're going to kill off all the ones without the resistance, and the ones that do have the resistance are going to be able to live long enough to pass on that trait for resistance. And now suddenly, yeah, you got rid of all the ones that didn't have it, but now the ones that did have that resistance or that mutation are able to live long enough, pass on those traits, and before you know it, that population of the ones that have that resistance or are able to survive in the presence of that bug spray, now you're going to have a big boom in the amount of organisms that, or the amount of insects that are resistant to the insecticide. So eventually, only insects that are resistant to insecticide will remain, and each year researchers look for newer and stronger insecticides to use. But over time, we use stronger and stronger stuff, but there's more and more mutations, and then we're constantly trying to fight off these insects. A very similar example is when we talk about antibiotics. So well, nowadays we're trying to dial back on the amount of antibiotics that we're giving people. Well, why is that? Because when we kill bacteria with antibiotics, we find that some bacteria might have a resistance to it as well. They might be able to survive in the presence of that antibiotic. And if they're able to survive when the antibiotic is around, well, they must have some kind of trait or some mutation that makes it be able to survive. And although you're killing off all the ones that don't have it, the ones that do have that mutation or that resistance to it are just going to keep multiplying, and eventually all the bacteria that is around are going to be the ones that are resistant to antibiotics, and our antibiotics are not going to work anymore. Another example, the Galapagos finches, like I talked about. Right? Darwin saw on the Galapagos Islands, they had all these different finches, and he realized that, you know what, they're all very similar, but they have different beak shapes and beak sizes, and that's because they needed a specific beak shape and a specific beak size in order to survive and in order to eat the food that's on each specific island. So phylogenetic trees are usually what we like to use in order to show how things progressively change over time. You have these kind of diagrams that show you how one organism becomes another organism, or an organism branches off into two different organisms. Sometimes they're called family trees, evolutionary trees, cladograms. All these things are talking about the same thing. I usually just call them a phylogenetic tree, and that is the diagram. So if you look at this phylogenetic tree, it gives you this kind of, you see the white, these are the branches of the tree. So you start out with one type of finch, okay, and that's, we call that our ancestral finch. And then that actually branched off into warbler finches and all these type of finches. And then from there, all right, so initially it branched off into two, depending, because it was in two different environments. Well, as it went to other environments, it continued to branch off. So now this warbler finch became two different types of warbler finches, and this new ancestral finch became bud eaters, or whatever was this, okay? And then this became ground finch and tree finches, and they continue to branch off as you go over time. So now we get to look at these and we could say, hey, what's going to be the organism that is most related to the mangrove finch? So we look at this mangrove finch and we say, well, where is the most recent ancestor? Well, the most recent ancestor, the most recent split is right here. And where did it split into? Well, it became the woodpecker finch. So that is the most closely related species to the mangrove finch. Same thing goes for if I'm going to look at this medium ground finch and I say, you know what is most closely related to this medium ground finch? Well, I start going backwards, looking in my tree, and I see, oh, there was a branch here where one type of finch branched off into two different types of finches. And what happened here was it became the medium ground finch, but it also became, right, or instead of becoming, it also branched off to become the large cactus groundfinch. So we can look at these and see the lineage and how long ago did organisms branch off from each other and which ones are most closely related. And we like to look at where it is that how we really became humans. Right, so we start to look at these things called transitional species, and transitional species are ones that really made giant leaps, as much as over the billions of years of going from single-celled organisms to becoming very complex organisms like humans. It was very important to keep moving along the way, but there are different things that really made giant changes. So certain species that have a major impact on the future species, we call them transitional species. So this uh, Gaiu oneros, all right, Gaiu oneros, was the first known bony fish. So before that, they weren't bony fish, and this kind of made a giant leap to eventually become amphibians. And the first kind of somewhat amphibian where we see that it made the transition from being a fish that's in the water to something that tried to make its way out of the water is this Tiktaalik rosei. And the Tiktaalik was really the first thing that kind of had this elbow joint. So instead of just having a regular fin, it kind of was able to push itself up off of the rocks and leave the water a little bit. So this was our transition to land. And then from there, we really became kind of amphibians, and we see this Hylonomus lyelli. It was believed to be the transitional species of amphibian that led to reptiles. So now we're becoming these things that don't need the water at all. And then Purgatorius is believed to be the transitional species from moving from reptiles to mammals. All right, really the first primate. And then we see that Homo erectus, all right, we're Homo sapiens. Well, Homo erectus was a transitional species because it was the first human-like organism that was able to survive outside of Africa. So as much as we have different types of humanoid that humanoids in Africa. You have Ardipithecus and these other ape-like species. Well, the first one that was able to really leave Africa was this Homo erectus, and it also was very transitional or made a big impact because it started to have a very large brain, stood upright, and it really used tools which most organisms do not do. So when we talk about evolution, we can actually look at structures apart from looking at DNA, which is really what we look at nowadays. Once upon a time, you were able to look at structures, and what we see is that we have similar structures, and they don't look exactly the same, all right, but the concept is very similar, and we call them homologous structures, homo being the same, so they look very much the same. And the homologous structures, if you look at something like the arm, well, the human arm has the humerus, and it has your tibia and your it has the radius and the ulna, and then it has your wrist bones, and then it has your hand bones, and they have kind of this thing where we got one big bone, two smaller bones, a bunch of little bones, and then your five rod-like bones for your palm and your hand. Well, when you look at other things, they also have something very similar to that, where if you look at say like a frog, look, they got something where it's one, then they have this one where it's kind of like two, and then you have little bones and then rod like bones. Here you see the same thing. One, two, little bones, rod like bones. One, two, little bones, rod like bones. So phylogenetic trees, um, show that more recent common ancestors are more closely related than the earlier common ancestors. And you can use something like this, a phylogenetic tree like this, and they can ask you, identify the group of organisms that's most closely related to the arthropoda group. All right, well, arthropoda is right here. So if I see this, I go back and I want to find the most recent branching, and you say, oh, Annelida. Annelida. And why? Because it shares the, all right, they all share common ancestors because this is the common ancestor for all of them, but it shares the most recent common ancestor. All right. So like I said, evolution is a change in a species over a long period of time. It's not survival of the strongest, the biggest, or the smartest. It's survival of the fittest. So we're going to look at more examples of these as we move forward and really try to see all the evidence that really proves that evolution has occurred, that the theory of evolution is true. When we talk about a theory in science, theory doesn't mean a guess or anything like that. It means that it's something that we can't necessarily prove because I can't go back in time and show you how we became humans from a single-celled organism. We can't go, I can't show you over billions of years, but I can put together a lot of evidence and basically prove my point. So that's what theory in science means, even though you might use theory differently in your everyday life. So keep these things in mind as we move forward. Don't be afraid to go back to this video as we keep doing more assignments and looking at the different parts of the notes.